A sports icon, known for his towering height and impressive physique, had spent years making history on the playing field. Loved by millions, his every move was watched by fans all over the world. Yet today, he was seeking something different, a rare moment of peace. For once, he wanted to escape the spotlight. And what better way than a solo trip to the movies? His name was O'Neal. O'Neal was no ordinary man. Standing over 2 meters tall with an aura of strength and power, he had conquered every challenge an athlete could face. Awards, medals, and admiration flooded his life. Yet behind his fame was the heart of a humble man, a black boy from a poor neighborhood who had fought to rise above adversity. Despite his success, O'Neal remained grounded, never allowing the attention to change who he was. Today was different. After months of non-stop travel, interviews, and public appearances, O'Neal decided he needed a break, a day away from the chaos. The world around him had grown overwhelming, and he yearned for something simple, the quiet of a movie theater. As O'Neal prepared for his day, he stood before the mirror, admiring the quiet strength he had built. His gaze softened as he considered how rare moments of stillness had become. "I'm just going to the movies," he told himself with a smile. The suit and spotlight were left behind for a simple grey t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers. A baseball cap completed his look, a subtle attempt to go unnoticed. Arriving at the theatre, O'Neal was engulfed in the atmosphere of families laughing, couples sharing quiet moments, and young people enjoying their weekend. It was a world away from the one he inhabited. The action film he'd chosen promised a few hours of distraction. As he entered the theatre, he ducked slightly, not used to spaces made for average-height individuals. Finding a seat in the middle, he settled in, preparing for a rare few hours of escape, but fate had different plans. The theatre was filled with excited moviegoers, yet one man stood out. A young police officer, eager and brash, had no idea who O'Neal was. He walked down the aisle with a sense of superiority, looking down on O'Neal simply because of his size, his presence, his black skin. With a sneer, the officer muttered a few words under his breath, words laced with judgment and racism. O'Neal could feel the tension rise. What started as a peaceful day turned into a moment of confrontation. As the officer's arrogance grew, so did the unease in the room. The moviegoers noticed the exchange, their excitement now replaced with confusion and discomfort. It wasn't just about a man sitting in the wrong seat. It was the ugliness of racism that had reared its head. What happened next shocked everyone. O'Neal, with his calm demeanor, stood up. Instead of engaging in a verbal battle, he used his actions to make a statement. His towering presence and quiet strength spoke volumes. The officer, realizing his mistake, felt a pang of regret. In that instant, the entire room was silent, the power of the moment undeniable. The incident became the talk of social networks, spreading like wildfire. People were moved not just by the confrontation, but by O'Neal's graceful handling of the situation. It was a profound lesson in humanity, justice, and the strength it takes to rise above hatred. O'Neal, the man who had faced countless challenges on the field, had just demonstrated the greatest form of strength, the power of forgiveness and dignity. For O'Neal, this day was a reminder of why he remained humble despite the fame. He understood that beyond the medals and victories, it was the small moments, the quiet victories, that truly defined him. He had once again become a beacon of hope for those who needed it most, teaching the world a lesson in how to overcome adversity, not with anger, but with grace. O'Neal sat back in his seat, his tall frame almost a shadow against the dim theatre. Lighting. He glanced around, noticing a few surprised glances aimed at his impressive stature, but no one recognized him. In his simple grey t-shirt, jeans and sneakers, his larger-than-life persona seemed to vanish in the darkened space. For once, he wasn't the towering sports legend O'Neal. He was just a man enjoying a rare moment of peace. The theatre fell into stillness as the lights dimmed completely. The opening credits rolled and O'Neill found himself immersed in the movie. For the first time in years, there were no cameras, no cheers, no interviews or expectations. Just the movie and his own heartbeat in rhythm with the plot. It was blissful, almost surreal. The suspenseful twists and turns on the screen pulled him in, distracting him from the weight of his fame. Here, in the theatre, he wasn't O'Neill the icon. He was just a man, relishing the simplicity of life. But that peaceful moment was not destined to last. The young police officer entered, his gait strong, his presence unmistakable. He wore plain clothes, but everything about him, from the way he carried himself to the sharpness in his eyes, spoke volumes. He walked through the aisles, scanning the rows of seats, as if the world revolved around him. When his eyes locked onto O'Neill, his expression shifted. It wasn't awe or admiration, but rather irritation. The sight of the large man sitting in the middle of the theatre seemed to disturb him. O'Neill, unaware of the young officer's discomfort, continued watching the movie. However, the officer could not escape his annoyance. O'Neill's enormous stature was blocking his direct view of the screen, an issue the officer was not willing to tolerate. His eyes darted around the theatre, looking for an alternate seat. Unfortunately, every ideal seat had been taken. After a few moments of hesitation, the officer made his decision. With an exaggerated huff, he dropped himself down into the seat directly behind O'Neill. His movement was deliberate, the thud of his body hitting the seat reverberating through the theatre. The noise caused several people nearby to glance in his direction, their eyes full of disapproval. O'Neill glanced back, sensing the officer's presence, but he said nothing. The movie was too important to him to let a stranger disrupt his peace. However, the officer's behavior only escalated. Unhappy with his seat, he began shifting aggressively, his feet deliberately kicking into the back of O'Neill's seat. At first, O'Neill remained calm, refusing to be drawn into any confrontation. He focused on the screen, trying to ignore the officer's deliberate actions. But the kicks continued. The officer was making it clear that O'Neill's size was an inconvenience to him. Who would let such a big person sit in the middle of the theatre? The officer muttered loudly enough for those around to hear. A few of the audience members shot the officer disapproving glances, but no one spoke up. The theatre remained silent, the tension palpable. O'Neill kept his eyes glued to the screen, refusing to engage with the officer. His goal was simple, to enjoy this rare moment without confrontation. But the officer's taunts grew more persistent, and the discomfort in the air thickened. O'Neill's patience was being tested, but he refused to be provoked. He had faced far greater challenges in his life, both on and off the field. Today was about finding peace, and no amount of rudeness from a young, ignorant officer was going to take that from him. Still, the officer's words and actions spoke volumes, and the entire theatre could feel the shift from what was meant to be a calm moment to something much darker. O'Neill sat in his seat, the movie still playing, his mind focused on the flickering images on the screen. But the peace was once again shattered when the officer leaned forward, his voice loud and insistent. "Hey man, do you know how big you are? I can't see anything." His tone was sharp, filled with irritation. O'Neill turned his head slowly. His eyes were calm, but there was a firmness in his gaze. He had faced worse in his career, and this moment was no different. "I've been sitting here before. If you want, you can find another seat," O'Neill replied, his voice even. But the officer wasn't satisfied. His smirk grew as he leaned back in his seat. "Find another place? Not everyone here is as big as you, so why should they have to deal with someone like you taking up so much space?" His words were deliberately antagonistic, trying to provoke a reaction. And he didn't stop there. His words grew sharper, more venomous. "People like you, big guys like you, must be used to bothering others, right? You really don't know how to think." The words cut deep, their racist undertones clear. O'Neill had dealt with this kind of behavior before, ignorance masked as superiority. The atmosphere in the theatre became tense. A few audience members exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to speak up. The officer's words had filled the room with a discomfort that was impossible to ignore. O'Neill took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. He knew how this went. He had encountered such racism throughout his career, and he understood that people like this officer often sought to provoke conflict, to exert their sense of power over others. But O'Neill was not easily moved. "I just want to see a movie," O'Neill responded, his voice calm but firm. The officer's response was a sneer. "Then you should sit somewhere that doesn't block others. Or better yet, find another theatre that fits your size." His words were loud enough for the people around to hear, and a ripple of murmurs spread across the room. An elderly man, sitting 2 rows away, leaned toward the person next to him and whispered, "This is too much. He has no right to say that." Despite the audience's quiet disapproval, the officer continued. His desire to provoke O'Neill had reached a boiling point. He leaned forward even closer, his breath hot against O'Neill's ear. "Who do you think you are, sitting there and bothering people just because you're big? That doesn't make you important." O'Neill's eyes narrowed. The situation was escalating, but he refused to give the officer the satisfaction of a loud argument. He turned back to face the screen, his voice low but unwavering. "You can either watch the movie or leave. I'm not causing anyone any trouble, and I don't want to argue." The officer laughed derisively, the sound harsh and cruel. "Oh, no argument. You guys are always like that. Big but timid when things get tough, right?" O'Neill remained silent. He knew arguing with someone like the officer would only make things worse. His silence, however, seemed to fuel the officer's rage. The young man stood up, leaned over the back of O'Neill's seat, and placed his hand on O'Neill's broad shoulder. "Hey, I told you to move. Did you hear me?" he insisted, his voice now full of challenge. O'Neill's patience was nearing its end. He slowly stood up, his immense height and stature towering over the officer, who now looked up in stunned realization. The theatre, once filled with the excitement of the movie, was now frozen in a tense silence. O'Neill's presence, his calm, yet unyielding posture commanded the room's attention. O'Neill towered over the officer, his quiet strength clearly overwhelming him. Yet, despite the officer's attempts to provoke him, O'Neill did nothing more than gently remove the officer's hand from his shoulder, his voice calm and resolute. "I don't want any trouble. Please, sit down and leave me alone." But the officer's pride was wounded, and humiliation began to take root. He couldn't stand the fact that a black man, whoever he was, had dared to challenge him. The officer's rage flared as he leaned in closer, his eyes flashing with hatred. "Don't think I'm afraid of you just because you're so big," he growled. "You're just a commoner, no better than me." The comfortable, quiet atmosphere of the theatre had evaporated, replaced by the officer's biting sarcasm. What had started as a complaint about O'Neill's size quickly turned into insults, aimed both at the man's character and his skin colour. "Hey man, has anyone told you that you're like a moving wall? You're blocking my view," the officer sneered, his words dripping with provocation. O'Neill didn't flinch. He remained focused on the screen, his calm demeanour unshaken. He had dealt with far worse in his life. Malicious words had been hurled at him throughout his career, yet he had learned to respond with dignity. Silence was often the most powerful answer, especially when dealing with ignorance. But the officer, emboldened by O'Neill's lack of reaction, escalated. "What a big ape," he muttered, loud enough for the nearby audience to hear. A few people turned to look, their disapproving gazes directed at the officer, but no one spoke up. O'Neill remained motionless, his eyes glued to the screen. His deep breath was an attempt to block out the insults and focus on the film. But the officer's taunts only grew louder. "Can you sit quietly and watch the movie?" O'Neill finally turned, his voice calm but firm. "Sit still." The officer's sneer grew wider. Are you kidding me? How can I be still when your head is as big as a television and blocks the screen? Actually, you're bigger than the screen. O'Neill met the officer's gaze. His eyes revealed no anger, only calm resolve. I bought a ticket for this seat. I have no intention of moving. You can change seats if you want. I see plenty of empty seats over there. His words only served to anger the officer further. The officer, feeling his pride hurt by being challenged, seethed with contempt. A police officer, someone with power, being dismissed by someone he considered beneath him, that was something he couldn't accept. "Move," the officer said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Listen, man, I'm not the one who needs to move. You're the one who's bothering everyone here." The officer's tone shifted. He no longer cared to hide the racial undertones in his words. "Let me guess," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You're probably used to living in a place without rules, huh? Like the jungle." Gasps rippled through the audience as the officer's words cut deeper into the silence of the theatre. O'Neill's body stiffened for a moment, the weight of the insult settling in. But he quickly regained his composure. Reacting angrily would only make the situation worse. Instead, he responded, his voice calm and unwavering. "I don't think that's appropriate here, man. Be respectful of others." The officer laughed bitterly, dismissing O'Neill's words with a scoff. "You guys always demand respect, but never know how to behave. Big guys with no brains." O'Neill stayed still, his gaze fixed on the screen, refusing to engage in the officer's verbal assault. The officer, growing more enraged by O'Neill's silence, felt that he had the upper hand. His words became sharper, louder. "Who do you think you are?" the officer shouted, no longer caring that the people around him were beginning to notice. "A big guy who can do whatever he wants, right? Just because you're big doesn't mean you're anything special." The tension in the room thickened, the audience waiting for what O'Neill would do next. He had every right to retaliate, to stand up to the officer, but O'Neill understood something deeper. Some battles were not worth fighting with words. His silence, his calm, was his defiance against hatred and ignorance. In a world where people often use their words to tear others down, O'Neill chose to rise above it, a true testament to the power of patience, dignity, and humanity. The tension in the theatre had reached its breaking point. The young police officer, growing increasingly agitated, leaned in closer to O'Neill, his voice sharp and filled with venom. "This isn't a football field, you know," he sneered, his anger boiling over. "You think you can do whatever you want just because you're big." O'Neill closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath as he fought to keep his composure. He had dealt with pressure, insults, and racism throughout his career. But today, in this dark theatre, the officer's words cut deeper than usual. Still, he didn't allow himself to lose control. The officer's taunts continued. He stood up, glaring at O'Neill, his voice growing louder with each word. "You're a... You know that? Don't think you can do anything just because you're big. This is my country, and I'm not going to let you run amok." The theatre fell into a tense silence, the air thick with hostility. All eyes were now on the officer and O'Neill, some of the audience pulling out their phones to record the scene. O'Neill's towering figure cast a shadow over the officer as he slowly stood up. The officer, barely reaching O'Neill's chest, felt insignificant in comparison. O'Neill's calm, powerful presence filled the space, yet he chose to remain composed. "I don't need to pick a fight with you, and I don't want to stoop to your level," O'Neill said, his voice calm but forceful. "I'm here to watch a movie, just like everyone else. If you can't accept that, then it's not my problem." For a moment, the officer was stunned. He had expected more of a reaction, but instead, he was met with O'Neill's quiet dignity. His pride, bruised by O'Neill's refusal to engage, only fueled his anger further. His teeth clenched as he spat out the next insult. "Don't lecture me, you big black man. I'm not afraid of you." The words stung, but O'Neill did not flinch. He stared at the officer, his eyes showing no anger, just quiet contempt. The room seemed to hold its breath, the tension palpable. Then, something remarkable happened. A woman sitting nearby stood up, her voice breaking through the oppressive atmosphere. "Stop it! We're here to watch a movie, not to listen to you insult others," she shouted, her words sparking a few more voices from the audience. Others joined in, urging the officer to stop, but he merely smiled, as though he was untouchable above it all. "What I do is my business," the officer sneered, dismissing the growing chorus of voices. "Let no one interfere." At that moment, a gunshot rang out from the movie on the screen, startling the officer. His hand, trembling with rage, tightened around the grip of his gun. The gunshot seemed to be the last straw for the young officer, and in an instant, his anger erupted uncontrollably. Without warning, the officer drew his pistol from his belt and pointed it directly at O'Neill. "Stand still! Don't move, you! Damn giant!" he shouted, his voice shaking with fury. The entire theatre froze. The laughter, the chatter, all stopped, eyes locked in disbelief as they saw the officer, gun raised, breathing heavily, his eyes wild with anger. A woman's scream echoed through the room, sending waves of panic through the audience. People near O'Neill began to rise from their seats, scrambling to escape the escalating violence. "What the hell are you doing?" a man from the front row shouted, his voice trembling in fear. But the officer paid no attention. His eyes were locked on O'Neill, his grip tightening around the gun, his emotions spiraling out of control. Yet O'Neill remained seated, his posture unshaken. His calm demeanor was almost unsettling in the face of such danger. His eyes met the officer's not with fear, but with steady resolve. "Calm down, man." O'Neill's voice was low and firm, but it carried an undeniable gentleness. "There's no need to make a big deal out of this." The air was thick with tension, every person in the theatre holding their breath. The officer's hand wavered, the gun still pointed at O'Neill, but the calm in O'Neill's eyes seemed to pierce through the chaos. His silence and steady presence became the most powerful statement in the room. In this crucial moment, O'Neill's restraint, his refusal to be provoked, and his unshakable calm stood as a testament to the strength found in silence. Something the officer could never comprehend. The air in the theatre was electric with tension. The officer, gun still shaking in his hands, yelled again, his voice raw with fury. "We just want to watch a movie. Shut up." His face twisted with anger as the weapon remained aimed at O'Neill. "Who do you think you are, talking to me like that?" "I don't care who you are, you're just a big black guy who deserves to be taught a lesson." A wave of panic spread through the theatre as people began to flee their seats, scrambling to find an exit. Footsteps pounded against the floor, chairs scraped loudly as some people ducked behind their seats, hiding in fear of the gun. The terror was palpable. "Please, put the gun down!" a woman shouted desperately, her voice trembling. "This is a movie theatre. There are children here. Don't hurt anyone." But the officer, consumed by anger and a dangerous sense of power, ignored her plea. His eyes were wild, and his grip on the gun tightened. O'Neill stood his ground, his gaze unwavering, never breaking contact with the officer. His voice, though low and calm, cut through the chaos, as if trying to bring the situation under control. "Look," he said, his tone quiet yet firm. "I don't want anything bad to happen. You don't want anything bad to happen, do you? We can work this out, non-violently." But the officer's sneer deepened. His voice was thick with mockery. "Do you think I will listen to you? I'm so tired of people like you, always acting like you're important, like you're good. But in reality, you are nothing." The insult stung, but O'Neill's focus remained clear. He recognized that the situation was growing dangerously out of control. He couldn't allow pride or ego to dictate his actions. This was not the time to defend himself or argue about right or wrong. His goal was to ensure that no one, especially the innocent people around him, would be harmed. "I'm leaving," O'Neill said, his voice steady but full of resolve. He slowly rose to his feet, his hands raised to show the officer he had no intention of escalating things. "Get out of here!" the officer roared, his voice frenzied, his gun still pointed at O'Neill's chest. "I don't want to cause trouble," O'Neill said, his voice thick with quiet strength. "And I don't want you to regret this. I just want everyone to be safe." O'Neill's willingness to leave, his calm demeanor in the face of danger, seemed to unsettle the officer. But instead of de-escalating, the officer's rage surged. "Go away and never show your face to me again!" he barked, trying to assert his power one final time. O'Neill, with a deep breath, turned and walked out of the theatre. The eyes of the audience followed him in stunned silence, some with sympathy, others with admiration, but none brave enough to intervene. The injustice was clear, but the fear of the officer's wrath kept them quiet. Outside the theatre, the cold wind hit O'Neill's face, but it did little to cool the fire inside him. The sadness, the hurt, the sting of injustice. It all weighed on him. He wasn't afraid of the gun. He was frustrated and disheartened by the hatred he had just encountered. He had seen it before, but this time it felt even more senseless and cruel. O'Neill took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew this wasn't the end. The truth would come out, and people would see what had really happened. But for now, the weight of the situation lingered with him. Back inside the theatre, the incident was far from over. Several audience members had been recording the scene on their phones, capturing every tense moment. As the clips began to circulate on social media, they went viral almost instantly. Hundreds of thousands of people watched, shared, and reacted in disbelief. The officer, completely unaware that his actions were being recorded, sat back in his seat with a smug, satisfied look on his face. He thought his authority had won, but what he didn't know was that he had just become the subject of the very thing he despised: accountability. The truth would soon come to light, and no amount of arrogance could change that. The officer, Derek Thompson, thought he had taught O'Neill a lesson, but in reality, he had put himself in an untenable situation. As soon as O'Neill left the theatre, a moviegoer, quick to act, posted a video of the entire incident to social media. The video, just 3 minutes long, captured every second of the confrontation, from the officer's insults to the gun being drawn. The shaky footage showed the officer shouting threats at O'Neill amidst the chaos of the theatre, leaving no room for misinterpretation. As the video spread, it quickly became apparent that the man in question was none other than Shaquille O'Neal. With his iconic stature and deep voice, O'Neill was easily recognized, and many were left in disbelief at the way he had been treated, especially by someone who was supposed to be upholding the law. Fans around the world were outraged. "This is crazy. Who would treat O'Neill like this?" one user commented, followed by an angry emoji. "Unacceptable. A global sporting icon being treated like this just because of the color of his skin," another added. Within minutes, the video shot to the top of Twitter trends, with thousands of comments from athletes, celebrities, and fans all voicing their support for O'Neill. "Shaq is a legend. No one, not even him, deserves to be insulted and threatened like this. This is intolerable," one famous athlete tweeted. A politician added his voice to the growing uproar, posting an Instagram video saying, "Racism is a social disease. Today it's Shaq, tomorrow it could be any of us." Amidst the outrage, O'Neill also received an overwhelming wave of support. Fans shared stories of his kindness and humility. He wasn't just a sports legend, but a man who gave back to his community. Shaq once paid for an entire store when they were struggling. He was a man who gave back to society. His actions today are an insult to all of us, one post read. Images of O'Neill signing autographs for children, participating in charity events, and even humorous moments from his television appearances flooded social media. It became clear that this wasn't just a simple case of a fan being mistreated. This was a larger issue of systemic racism that had to be addressed. The next morning, Sheriff David Collins was in his office, drinking his coffee, when he received a call from his assistant. The voice on the other end was serious. "Sir, we have a big problem. A video involving one of our officers is circulating on social media. It involves Shaquille O'Neal." Collins froze. As the sheriff, he had always taken pride in his department's integrity, but on a personal level he was also a huge fan of O'Neal. He watched every game and admired the basketball legend for not only his athleticism, but also his philanthropic efforts. O'Neal was a symbol of dedication, humility, and kindness, and this incident shook Collins to his core. "Send me that video. Right now," Collins demanded. As the video played on his computer screen, the sheriff's face darkened with anger and disappointment. The image of the young, arrogant officer pulling a gun on O'Neal in the middle of a movie theater while spewing racist insults filled him with disgust. This was not just an abuse of power, it was blatant racism. Without wasting any time, Collins called for an emergency meeting with his internal investigation team. In the conference room, standing before his senior officers, his voice was cold and firm. "We are facing a serious issue that not only concerns the image of this department, but also the trust of the community. This is not just an abuse of power. This is an act of open racism. I want this investigation to be a top priority," Collins said, his eyes sharp. The internal investigation began immediately. The team worked quickly, collecting statements from witnesses who had been at the cinema and reviewing the footage that was circulating online. As they dug deeper, it didn't take long for them to find clear evidence that the officer, Derek Thompson, had intentionally provoked O'Neal from the very beginning. Witnesses confirmed that Thompson had expressed discomfort with O'Neal's large size and had resorted to racial slurs almost immediately. Thompson's work record was also examined, and it soon became clear that he had a history of issues, both with his conduct on the job and with his interactions with the public. The evidence was mounting, and the investigation was only getting started. The question now was whether the department would hold Thompson accountable for his actions, or allow him to escape the consequences of his blatant misconduct. Derek Thompson, the officer at the center of the controversy, had long been a subject of complaints from black residents in the area for unprofessional behavior and discriminatory attitudes. Unfortunately, due to a lack of clear evidence, these complaints had previously been dismissed. But now, with everything coming to light in the wake of the incident in the theater, it was undeniable. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, it became clear to the investigation team that Thompson's actions were a serious breach of not just protocol, but human decency. Collins, feeling the weight of the situation, decided to confront Thompson directly before making a final decision on his fate. The following day, Collins invited Thompson into his office. Thompson walked in with a calm expression, but there was a noticeable unease in his eyes. "Sir, I was just doing my job." Thompson began his defense. "I don't think I did anything wrong." Collins remained composed, though his voice carried the weight of authority. "Doing your job? You think it's your job to point a gun at someone sitting quietly watching a movie? You think it's appropriate to use racial slurs in any situation?" The room fell silent as Thompson struggled to respond. "You abused your power," Collins continued. "Your actions not only damaged the reputation of the police force, but also hurt a man who is respected around the world. I cannot tolerate your actions." The next day, the official announcement came. Derek Thompson was dismissed from the police force, and his case would be referred to the judiciary for a review of potential legal violations. The media quickly picked up the story, and Collins held a press conference to address the situation. "The police force exists to protect and serve the community, not to abuse power or cause harm," Collins said firmly. "We will not tolerate any behavior that violates those principles from anyone in our ranks." Thompson's case became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the consequences of arrogance and racism. Human rights groups praised Collins' decision, calling it a necessary step in holding law enforcement accountable for their actions. They urged other agencies to take similar action in similar cases. When asked about the incident, O'Neal responded with surprising calmness, simply stating, "I wouldn't want this to happen to anyone else. Hopefully, this will be a reminder to treat each other with respect, no matter who we are." For the community, the incident sparked renewed discussions about racism and the abuse of power in the police force. Many hoped that this tragic event would lead to real changes within the system, ensuring that no one else would have to endure the treatment O'Neill had faced. As for Thompson, the consequences were severe. Once a promising young officer, he now faced the judgment of society. His actions had cost him his career, his reputation, and his opportunity to serve the community he once swore to protect. His downfall became a warning to others that acts of arrogance and discrimination would not be tolerated and would come with a heavy price. The story of this incident, though painful, was shared widely, and its impact on the community and beyond was undeniable. Collins's decision resonated as a turning point, a small but important step toward justice. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If you found it meaningful, please click like, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next important story.